Greetings, it is I, Tantus Naravan Dracovin, Lord and Emperor of the Dracovin Empire, and welcome. It's time to continue our discussion on the PATHFINDER Roleplaying game system, and we've been moving into more stuff on combat. Today, everything is going to be about moving around during combat. So let's talk about the basics of it. So your tactical movement is going to be moving your character's speed around the board. It can be modified by various things. If you're encumbered, if you're in heavier armor, they can reduce your maximum speed. You can encounter difficult terrain, poor visibility, or obstacles which could slow you down. On your turn, you're going to be moving your speed, unless you hit any of those sort of things. You could also just, if you do nothing else except for move, you can move double your speed. You can choose to take a run action and move 4 times your speed. Again, that can be modified by things like encumbrance and heavier armor. Not just reducing your speed, it can reduce what your multiplication for running is. Now, if you make a full round action, you can always make a 5-foot step. That's at least something you can do to move around the board. And there are some things that can affect your movement and be positive enhancement bonuses, such as a barbarian and a monk. They get bonuses to speed normally. Now, tactical movement is based around a grid system, where each square on the grid is a 5-foot square. That means 5 by 5. Normally, I would break that down. I would move one 5-foot square. I'd move 5 feet at a time. So if I have a speed of 30, I can move 6 squares in a line. Now, I can move diagonals too on this board, but diagonals work a little different. The first square diagonal I move, it counts as 1 square, 5 feet. The second one counts as 2 squares, 10 feet. So for every 2 squares I move diagonally, I've moved 15 feet instead of 10. Now, you can diagonal around certain things. You can't diagonal around cover. So if I'm like around a wall, I can't diagonal through the wall, I have to move around it. I can diagonal around a creature. I can diagonal around an obstacle, like something that might be like a pit in the floor, like a hazard obstacle. I can diagonal around that just fine. And the creature doesn't have to be, creature could be friend or foe. I could diagonal move around. Now you can move through squares that are occupied by other creatures. There's a lot of rules for these. The first one is you can move through a friend square without any trouble. An enemy square, maybe not. As long as they're not helpless, you can't move through it. If they're helpless, you can move through it. You cannot end on the square of another creature, whether friend or foe, unless they are helpless. Now, there are some things you can do to overcome this. There's the overrun maneuver you can do. I'll talk about that in another episode, but that's a maneuver you can do to basically move into someone else's square. You can tumble through it. You can use acrobatics as a skill and use the tumble version of acrobatics to move through their square. It becomes an option. Of course, very small things, fine, diminutive, or tiny things can actually move into something else's square. That's a rule they have just for being that small. Now, granted, they provoke an attack of opportunity to move into someone's square like that, but they can just move into your square and occupy the same one. Now, it sort of is the reverse a little bit, but if you're moving into the square of something that is 3 size categories larger than you, so if you're a medium creature, it would be a gargantuan creature, because that's 3 categories larger than you, you could just move into its square. You could just move through there. You would provoke an attack of opportunity, but you could. Now, in the reverse, the gargantuan creature can just move through your square too, but again, they would also incur an attack of opportunity. Now, there's exceptions to this. If it's something that fills up the entire 5-foot cube that you'd be trying to move through, like some kind of ooze or like a gelatinous cube, for example, you can't move through its square. There's nothing through it. It's a special exception. You can't, there's nowhere to move through in that square. Now let's talk about some of those modifiers to your speed. There's the difficult terrain, which I mentioned. Difficult terrain basically means I have to use an extra square of movement for every square I make. So it would cost me 2 squares of movement to move to the square next to me, rather than just 1. Diagonal is automatically 3 to move a diagonal in difficult terrain. Right away, 3. Now you could have an obstacle, something that you can like sort of climb over, which may or may not need a skill check to overcome. But it's an obstacle like in between these 2 squares that I'm in that could be crossed over. It would require 2 squares of movement to cross over to the other side. This is not including the movement into that square. So I have to spend 2 squares to move across it, and I'd spend a square moving into that square effectively. So it costs me 3 to sort of cross over into that square over there. Now you can also squeeze into smaller areas. It's not squeezing like I'm squeezing in with a friend in a space. It's squeezing into an area that's very tight. If you squeeze into an area that's about half your size, you can do that without kind of making any skill checks. So it's like 2.5-foot wide area, I can squeeze into it. I would get -4 to my attack and -4 to my AC, but I can do that just fine. You know, it's half the space that I would need as a medium creature. Now, granted, I can't end my turn, and I can squeeze past people in that area, but I could not end my turn there. I would have to squeeze past them. Now you can squeeze in something tighter. If you squeeze in something anything less than half your size, then you have to make an escape artist check to do it. Now while you're doing this, you can't attack. You still get -4 to AC, but now you also don't get your dex bonus to AC. So you're getting huge penalties to your AC to squeeze in this really, really tiny place, and maybe you have to make these escape artist checks and hope you're making them and not getting stuck. Now, if whatever should happen by accident, you're being forced to, something is happening that you're ending your turn, ending your movement in somebody else's square. That means you're not doing it on purpose. Something is forcing you effectively to do this. You don't stop there. You're actually pushed back to the last legal square you could be in, or the closest legal square you could go to. So you're effectively pushed out of the way to the where you had just come from, or the closest square to there, whichever is free. Now, if multiple things are slowing you down, just not like if you're in difficult terrain and maybe a magic spell is also slowing you down, those don't just add together, they multiply. So let's say something is happening that I'm moving at double speed. I'm moving at half speed. So I'm moving, it costs me 2 squares to move through 1 square of movement for whatever reason, and then I hit difficult terrain, it would cost me 4 squares. You can keep multiplying them if more effects hit you that you could get. It cost you 8 squares. It could cost you 16 squares for 1 square of movement. That can really suck. You can make it that you almost seem like you couldn't move, but you can. You're always allowed to move as a full round action, no matter how difficult the terrain is, no matter how difficult it is to move into that square, 5 feet. This will incur an attack of opportunity. This is not a 5-foot step, since you cannot do that into any kind of difficult terrain. This is just 5 feet of movement as a full round action that provokes. So that's everything I wanted to talk about today. I went over the rules of movement, and I talked about them. I went over sort of moving around the board, things that can modify it, and sort of tactical movement on said board. So if you have any questions, comments, anything you want to say, anything you think I left out, leave in the comments below. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Shows your support for the channel and the Empire. Please subscribe if you already have it. Always looking for more members, more citizens of the Empire. And please share this video if you know anyone that would learn anything from it or would just enjoy watching it. And until the next time, I bid you farewell.